question I get quite a bit in the planning stages of a safari, or especially when we're out on safari, is what's the difference between a national park and a game reserve and all these other various conservation designations of the places that you might visit on a safari. This is a really good question, and good to know, very interesting, and to learn about the way these areas are managed, but it's also quite important when it comes to your safari, because it does affect what you can do, where you can go, and how much you're going to pay. Okay, so the easiest way to think about it is start top to bottom. Of course, all different countries, different areas, there's all sorts of little variations and intricacies, but national park, we'll start there. That's the easiest one. That's your highest conservation designation, of course. So the only thing that's allowed there is tourism, photographic tourism. Okay, so there's no off-take otherwise, and that's your classic safari camps and lodges inside the national park. Serengeti National Park, Roja National Park, Chobe National Park. Okay, so that's your highest designation, and then coming down from there you will have a game reserve, and in some countries it's called, slightly different names, but a game reserve, to take the Tanzanian context, is somewhere where you have tourism, but you can also have hunting, trophy hunting, whatever you want to call it, and fishing and various other activities like that as well. To be fair, these days fishing sometimes in national parks as well, and so that's a slightly lower designation, and sometimes that will be run by a slightly different institution. So for example, in Tanzania, Tanzania National Parks run the national parks, and another group called TAWA, Tanzania Wildlife Authority, run the game reserves. Maybe that's a bit too much detail. In game reserves, sometimes you have a bit more flexibility. So like I said, other activities available, but sometimes you can do things like off-roading. Maybe another video on that, but a little bit controversial, but can be cool. If you're really trying to track a particular animal, you're really getting into it with your photography, and it can depend on the landscape as well. Sometimes difficult terrain, rocky terrain, sometimes you need to off-road, otherwise it's just difficult to get around. And then down from game reserve you have all sorts of different ones, forest reserves, and so on, which are much lower designation, that we tend to not deal with so much. You're not really going to visit those places so much. And then in different countries, you also have concessions, and concessions is a new one that sort of entered the safari parlance, and it's kind of significant for us because it is a bit like a game reserve in that it's not a national park, but they're often bordering national parks. They're often contiguous or linked to game reserves, which can be seen as buffer zones or buffer areas for national parks, which means basically a big area in between community or farming settlement and the national park, and it's used as a place where animals can come and go, and humans can use as well to different degrees. Of course, you've got to remember a lot of these places, especially in East Africa, where we have the big wild areas still, national parks are not fenced. Some of them are now. I think places like Kenya, they're getting more fences. So these buffer zones are important. Other things very important, like wildlife corridors. That's really crucial things for big species like elephants and wildlife in general to be able to move around. Anyway, this is a complicated topic, as you can see. Concessions important, because they are much smaller, but they are increasingly private now. So not necessarily privately owned, but are privately contracted, so that companies or safari outfits can use them for a few years at a time on an exclusive basis. So of course Botswana is very famous for that. Kenya increasingly, around Masai Mara, the northern conservancies, and in Tanzania too you have places like Chemchem, the area in between Tarangire and Manyara. And so that's great if you're going on a safari, because it's exclusive, and so you're going to have less vehicles and you can off-road, and you've got much more flexibility. And sometimes the wildlife is great as well if they're right opposite a national park, but of course there's something that you pay for. that exclusivity is expensive. Okay, so another one I just want to touch on real quick is Ngorongoro Conservation Area. That's one that causes quite a bit of confusion. It is the area obviously around Ngorongoro crater, the crater itself, the surrounding craters, and then the large area going down into the Serengeti Plains. Okay, it's one and the same with the Serengeti. It's not ecologically different in any way, it's just a human designation. Ngorongoro Conservation Area is kind of like a game reserve. It's run in conjunction or by the Maasai community, who've been there a long time. And of course it's unique in that you have lots of Maasai settlements inside and people grazing, and Maasai grazing their cattle inside, and they live with a lot of the wildlife there, which is great but difficult, you know. It's living alongside a lot of these big dangerous animals, and that area includes Ndutu, which is famous because of the calving season for the wildebeest and zebra migration in December, January, February. And that butts right up onto Serengeti National Park, so that's another important one you need to get your head around, or you need to work with someone who's got their head around that, because it does affect where you can go, how long you can stay out. You've got to be back at 6 o'clock in Ngorongoro Conservation Area and things like that, whether you want to cross over into southern Serengeti Kusini area. Nothing to do with us, by the way. Just realised I got my Matetsi hat on. Shout out Matetsi, incredible place. Hope to be back there one day. Till next time.